Have you ever wondered what really builds a family? Is it shared blood, stiff papers with rules, or the love that grows strong through tough times? The story I'm about to tell you isn't a sweet dream. It's a hard truth that can break 18 years of calm with just one question. Who are the true parents? Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. Serafina's weathered hands trembled as she held the crisp white envelope, its government seal gleaming like a wound in the morning light. At 73, she had survived losing her husband to cancer, burying her only child in a car accident, and 20 years of raising two children who weren't legally hers. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared her for the words burning into her soul. We are the biological parents of Kai and Luna Blackwood. We demand their immediate return. The letter crumpled in her grip as her knees buckled against the kitchen counter of their lakeside cottage. Through the window, she could see 18-year-old Kai teaching his sister Luna how to fish from their old wooden boat, the same vessel where she'd found them as abandoned babies during the worst blizzard Willowmere had ever seen. Their laughter echoed across the water like music, unaware that strangers with legal documents were about to shatter their world forever. The memory hit her like ice water, that December night 20 years ago when howling winds had torn through the village, and she'd stumbled to her boat seeking solitude in her grief. Instead, she'd found two blue-lipped infants wrapped in a torn blanket, so small and cold she'd thought they were dead until Luna's tiny fingers had curled around hers. No note, no explanation, just two dying babies and her choice to save them or let them freeze. She'd chosen love over law, warmth over paperwork, becoming their mother through midnight feedings, scraped knees, bedtime stories, and fierce protection. Now these biological parents, wherever they'd been hiding, wanted to undo 20 years of devotion with a single sheet of paper. The envelope bore a city postmark from Raven Hollow, 300 miles away, and an address that reeked of money and power. But what chilled her to the bone wasn't their wealth or their legal threats. It was the cold, clinical way they referred to Kai and Luna as assets to be recovered. Footsteps crunched on gravel outside, and Kai's voice called out, "Grandmama Sarah." Luna caught her first trout. She quickly shoved the letter into her apron pocket, forcing her face into a smile as the twins burst through the door like twin hurricanes of joy and mud. Kai, tall and lean with sea-green eyes, carried Luna on his back while she waved a fish triumphantly, her dark curls wild with lake spray. They were everything to her, her purpose, her redemption, her proof that love could bloom even in the aftermath of devastating loss. "Look what I caught." Luna squealed, holding up the silvery fish with pride that made Serafina's heart both soar and shatter. She gathered them into her arms, memorizing the warmth of their embrace, the smell of lake water and sunshine in their hair, the way they fit perfectly against her like puzzle pieces she'd never known were missing. In 12 hours, according to the letter, their biological parents would arrive to collect their children and rectify this unfortunate situation. The afternoon dissolved into a blur of forced normalcy as Serafina cooked their favorite meal, honey-glazed salmon with wild rice, while wrestling with an impossible decision. Should she tell them the truth and watch their world crumble before the strangers arrived? Or let them discover it when sharp-suited lawyers knocked on their door with custody papers and cold explanations? Every glance at their faces, Luna's gap-toothed grin, Kai's gentle eyes that reminded her so much of her late son, felt like stealing time from a clock that was running out. She'd built their entire life on the foundation that family meant love, not blood, that choosing to stay was more powerful than being born into something. Now she had to watch that foundation crack under the weight of legal reality and biological claims she couldn't fight without money, lawyers, or official adoption papers she'd never been able to afford. As twilight painted the lake purple and gold, the twins fell asleep on the couch during their nightly story, Luna's head on Kai's shoulder, their breathing synchronized like it had been since infancy. Serafina covered them with her grandmother's quilt and whispered the words she'd said every night for 20 years. "Sweet dreams, my darlings." Tomorrow will bring what tomorrow will bring, but tonight you are safe, you are loved, and you are home. But even as she spoke them, she knew tonight might be the last time those words would be true. The letter in her pocket felt like a death sentence, not for her, but for the only family that had ever mattered. Outside, storm clouds gathered over the lake, and somewhere in the distance, headlights were already cutting through the darkness, carrying strangers who claimed ownership of her heart. 20 years earlier, December 15th had been the darkest day of Serafina's life, even before she'd found the babies. She'd stood in the cemetery that morning, watching dirt fall onto her 7-year-old son Thomas's casket while her husband Marcus lay dying of lung cancer in the hospital bed she'd left to bury their child. The drunk driver who'd taken Thomas had walked away without a scratch, while she was left with a husband who had weeks to live and a hole in her chest where her heart used to be. By evening, Marcus was gone too, slipping away while she held his hand and whispered promises she didn't know how to keep. At 53, she was suddenly, completely alone in a world that felt too sharp and too cold to survive. The lake house they'd bought to raise their family and had become a mausoleum of memories she couldn't bear to face, filled with Thomas's toys and Marcus's reading glasses and the smell of a life that would never continue. She'd walked to the lake that night because drowning seemed easier than breathing, her feet moving automatically toward the old wooden boat Marcus had restored by hand. The blizzard was howling like something alive and angry, turning the world white and wild, erasing the boundaries between sky and water, between living and dying. She'd planned to row out into the storm and let the lake decide her fate. It seemed fitting that the water that had given them so much joy during family summers might offer her peace in return. But when she'd reached the boat, her flashlight had caught something that made her heart stop, a bundle of fabric moving ever so slightly against the wind. Inside were 2 babies, maybe 3 months old, their lips blue with cold, their tiny chests barely rising and falling. No note, no explanation. Just 2 dying infants someone had left like unwanted cargo in her boat during the worst storm in decades. For a moment that stretched like eternity, she'd stood frozen between her own death wish and their desperate need for life. They were so small, so fragile, like broken birds that had fallen from a nest she couldn't see. The girl baby's hand had moved first, tiny fingers uncurling to touch the boy's face, and something about that gesture, that instinctive connection between siblings, had shattered the ice around her heart. She'd scooped them up, feeling their hypothermic bodies against her chest, and run through the blizzard toward home, toward warmth, toward a purpose she hadn't asked for but couldn't abandon. In her kitchen, she'd worked frantically to warm them with blankets and her own body heat, calling Dr. Henderson, who'd arrived through the storm to confirm they'd survive. Someone left them there to die, he'd said grimly, examining their malnourished bodies and the infected cord stumps that suggested they'd been born without medical care. Another hour in that cold, and we'd be planning funerals instead of feedings. She'd named them that first night while they slept in her bed between heating pads and warm blankets, Kai, meaning ocean, for the boy who'd been found by water, and Luna, meaning moon, for the girl whose face was as pale and beautiful as moonlight. They'd cried in shifts for weeks, as if they'd agreed to take turns needing her attention, and gradually their presence had filled the terrible silence that had swallowed her house after Marcus and Thomas died. She'd had no legal right to keep them, no paperwork or official claims, but the village of Willowmere was small and close-knit, and when Dr. Henderson had quietly suggested that sometimes the best families were chosen rather than born, no one had asked uncomfortable questions. The police had made perfunctory inquiries about abandoned children, but with no reports of missing babies and no evidence of where they'd come from, the case had quietly disappeared into bureaucratic limbo. Serafina had become their mother through sleepless nights, first words, first steps, and the daily choice to love them more than she'd ever thought possible. The years had passed like pages in a fairy tale she'd never expected to live: birthday parties by the lake, Christmas mornings filled with laughter, scraped knees kissed better, school plays cheered from the front row. Kai had grown into a gentle giant who protected every wounded animal he found, while Luna had become a fierce little warrior who stood up to bullies twice her size and insisted on doing everything her brother did. They'd called her Grandmama Sarah from the moment they could speak, never questioning why she was older than other mothers or why they had no other relatives. She'd told them their parents had loved them very much but couldn't take care of them, so they'd chosen her to be their family, a version of truth that had satisfied their curiosity without destroying their innocence. But now, 20 years later, those biological parents had returned like ghosts from a past she'd thought was safely buried, ready to reclaim children they'd abandoned to die in a blizzard. The cruel irony wasn't lost on her. She'd saved their lives, raised them with love, and now faced losing them to the very people who'd nearly killed them through neglect. At exactly 9 o'clock the next morning, a black sedan with tinted windows pulled into Serafina's gravel driveway like a hearse arriving for a funeral. Through her lace curtains, she watched two figures emerge, a woman in an expensive navy suit with steel gray hair pulled into a severe bun, and a man whose silver hair and commanding presence radiated the kind of authority that came with money and political power. They moved with the calculated precision of people accustomed to getting their way, their polished shoes crunching on gravel as they surveyed the humble lakeside cottage with expressions of barely concealed disdain. The woman carried a leather briefcase that gleamed like a weapon, while the man checked his watch with the impatience of someone unused to waiting. Behind them, the sedan's driver remained motionless, hands folded, ready to transport whatever cargo his employers had come to collect. Serafina's hands shook as she smoothed her apron and prepared to face the people who wanted to destroy her world with legal documents and cold, biological claims. Kai and Luna were in the kitchen finishing breakfast, completely unaware that their universe was about to implode. Luna was making shadow puppets on the wall while Kai cleaned dishes, their easy companionship filling the room with warmth that these strangers could never understand or replicate. "Grandmama Sarah, why do you look so pale?" Luna asked, her dark eyes sharp with the intuition that had always made her seem older than her 18 years. Before Serafina could answer, 3 sharp knocks echoed through the house like gunshots, precise and demanding, the kind of knock that expected immediate compliance. Kai moved protectively toward the door, his broad shoulders squaring with instinctive caution, while Luna slipped her small hand into Serafina's, sensing danger in the air like an animal before a storm. The moment of truth had arrived, and Serafina felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to watch everything she'd built with love and sacrifice crumble into dust. She opened the door to find herself face to face with 2 pairs of eyes that were startlingly familiar. The woman had Luna's distinctive dark gaze, while the man possessed Kai's sea-green stare and strong jawline. "Mrs. Ashworth," the woman said in a voice like winter wind, not bothering with pleasantries or introductions. "I am Victoria Blackwood, and this is my husband, Senator Edmund Blackwood. We've come for our children." The words hit Serafina like physical blows, each syllable designed to establish dominance and ownership over the twins she'd loved and raised for 20 years. Edmund stepped forward, his politician's smile as cold as his wife's tone, extending a manicured hand that Serafina didn't take. "We appreciate everything you've done for Kai and Luna, but it's time for them to come home to their real family," he said, as if 2 decades of love and sacrifice could be dismissed with polite thanks and a handshake. Behind him, Victoria was already scanning the cottage's interior with calculating eyes, cataloging poverty like evidence in a case she'd already won. "What's happening?" Kai's voice cut through the tension as he and Luna appeared in the doorway, confusion and growing alarm written across their young faces. Victoria's expression softened for the first time as she took in her biological children, her hungry gaze devouring details of their growth and development like a starving person suddenly presented with a feast. "Hello, darlings," she said, her voice dropping to honeyed warmth. "We're your real parents, and we've come to take you home where you belong." Luna stepped backward instinctively, pressing against Serafina's side, while Kai's protective instincts flared as he moved between the strangers and his family. "Our home is here," he said firmly, his young voice carrying surprising strength. "Grandmama Sarah is our family." Edmund's smile never wavered, but his eyes hardened with the look of a man accustomed to removing obstacles from his path. "Son, you don't understand the full situation yet, but we have legal documents proving your identity and our parental rights. We've spent 20 years searching for you, and now we're here to give you the life you deserve, education at the finest universities, opportunities beyond anything this place could offer." Victoria opened her briefcase with theatrical precision, withdrawing official documents that rustled like dead leaves in the morning breeze. Birth certificates, DNA test results, legal custody papers signed by a federal judge, she announced, spreading them across Serafina's kitchen table like tarot cards predicting doom. "We have a lovely home in Raven Hollow, private tutors waiting, trust funds already established in your names." But even as she spoke of wealth and privilege, her eyes remained cold, calculating, viewing the twins not as beloved children, but as valuable assets that had been temporarily misplaced. Luna began to cry silently, tears streaming down her face as she clung to Serafina's hand, while Kai stood rigid with confusion and growing anger. "Why?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why did you abandon us? Why didn't you come sooner if you've been searching for 20 years? The question hung in the air like smoke, and for just a moment, Victoria's polished facade cracked, revealing something desperate and dangerous underneath. Edmund placed a warning hand on his wife's arm before answering smoothly, "We had to flee the country for political reasons when you were babies. Dangerous people wanted to hurt our family, so we hid you somewhere safe until we could return and reclaim you properly." The kitchen fell silent except for Luna's quiet sobbing and the tick of the grandfather clock that had measured every precious moment of their family's 20-year history. Serafina studied the Blackwoods with the sharp intuition that comes from decades of reading people's hearts, and what she saw chilled her more than any winter storm. Edmund's explanation was smooth, practiced, the kind of half-truth politicians perfected to hide ugly realities beneath noble-sounding motives. But Victoria's hands trembled slightly as she organized her legal documents, and her eyes held the haunted look of someone carrying guilt too heavy to bear. "Political reasons," Serafina repeated slowly, tasting the lie on her tongue. "You fled the country and left 2 newborn babies in an unlocked boat during a blizzard to keep them safe?" Her voice carried 20 years of midnight feedings, sick days, school plays, and unconditional love, experiences these biological parents had chosen to miss. Edmund's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only crack in his polished armor, while Victoria's breath caught like someone fighting tears she couldn't afford to shed in front of witnesses. "The details aren't important now," Victoria said quickly, too quickly, her lawyer's instincts taking over to prevent further questions. "What matters is that we're here to reclaim our children and give them the future they deserve." But Kai wasn't finished pressing for truth, his protective instincts sharpened by years of defending Luna from playground bullies and his own fierce loyalty to the woman who'd raised them. "If you've been searching for 20 years, why didn't you leave a note? Why didn't you contact police or social services? Why abandon us in a boat where we could have died?" His questions hit like hammer blows, each one exposing another hole in their carefully constructed story. Luna had stopped crying and was watching her biological parents with the same intensity she'd once used to study wild animals from their kitchen window, recognizing predators even when they wore human faces and expensive clothes. Something about their body language, their careful words, their obvious discomfort with genuine emotion, triggered every survival instinct she'd inherited from 20 years of being truly loved and protected. Victoria's composure cracked further under Kai's relentless questioning, and for a moment her mask slipped completely. "We were young and scared," she whispered, her voice raw with pain that sounded almost genuine. "Edmund was running for his first political office, and there were threats against our family from his opponents. We panicked and made a terrible choice, thinking it would only be temporary." But even as she spoke, her husband's warning glance reminded her to stay on script, to maintain the narrative they'd crafted to justify their return after 2 decades of absence. Edmund took over smoothly, his senator's training kicking in to control the conversation. "We left you with supplies and a note explaining everything, but the storm must have blown it away. We watched from a distance to make sure you were found safely, then left the country when our political enemies escalated their threats. The lies flowed like honey over broken glass, sweet enough to swallow, but deadly underneath. Serafina felt her heart breaking as she watched Kai's face. She could see him wanting to believe, wanting to forgive, desperate to understand why his biological parents had abandoned him and Luna to die. But Luna had inherited more than her mother's dark eyes. She'd also inherited Serafina's gift for seeing through pretty lies to ugly truths. "You're lying," she said quietly, her 18-year-old voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been loved enough to recognize its absence in others. "If you watched to make sure we were found safely, you would have known Grandmama Sarah saved us. You would have known we were alive and loved. But you didn't come back because you didn't care if we lived or died." Her words hit Victoria like physical blows, and the older woman's carefully constructed facade finally shattered completely. "You don't understand," she snapped, her lawyer's composure giving way to something desperate and ugly. "We were building something important, something bigger than personal feelings. Edmund's career was just beginning, and children would have been a liability, a weakness our enemies could exploit." The truth slipped out like poison from a wound, and the silence that followed was deafening. Luna had been right. They hadn't abandoned their children to protect them. They'd abandoned them because they were inconvenient obstacles to political ambition. Edmund moved quickly to contain the damage, placing himself between his wife and the children with the smooth precision of someone accustomed to managing crises. "What Victoria means is that we made difficult choices for the greater good," he said, his politician's smile never wavering even as his eyes turned cold as winter lakes. "But now we're established, secure, and ready to give you everything we couldn't 20 years ago. The best education, social connections, opportunities to change the world." But his words fell flat in the cottage kitchen where love had been measured not in opportunities, but in presence, not in what could be provided, but in what was shared daily for 20 years. Kai and Luna exchanged a look that spoke volumes. They were beginning to understand that these strangers saw them not as beloved children to be reunited with, but as political assets to be acquired. And somewhere in Victoria's calculated gaze, Serafina glimpsed something even more chilling, the cold assessment of someone who viewed the twins as tools for a larger agenda she hadn't yet revealed. The real reason for their return was still hidden beneath layers of lies, and whatever it was, Serafina knew it would tear her family apart even more completely than she'd imagined possible. The tension in the cottage kitchen reached a breaking point when Victoria suddenly softened her approach, recognizing that aggressive legal demands weren't winning her children's hearts. She knelt gracefully beside Luna's chair, her expensive perfume a sharp contrast to the homey smell of biscuits and lake air that filled Serafina's kitchen. "Darling, I know this is confusing and frightening," she said in a voice like silk over steel, "but you have to understand, we never stopped loving you. Every day for 20 years, we've carried the pain of losing you, wondering if you were safe, if you were happy, if you remembered us." Her performance was masterful, tears gathering in her eyes with practiced precision, but Luna recoiled instinctively from the touch of a woman who felt like a stranger wearing her mother's face. Kai watched the manipulation with growing disgust, his protective instincts screaming warnings that these people were dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with control. Even Edmund seemed impressed by his wife's acting ability, nodding approvingly as she played the role of grieving mother with Oscar-worthy conviction. "If you loved us, you wouldn't have left us to die," Luna said with devastating simplicity, her dark eyes reflecting none of the warmth Victoria was desperately trying to kindle. "Grandmama Sarah found us blue and barely breathing because you abandoned us during the worst blizzard in decades. If she hadn't been there, we would have frozen to death, and you would never have known or cared." The brutal honesty of an 18-year-old who'd been raised with unconditional love cut through Victoria's performance like a sword through tissue paper. For a moment, the older woman's mask slipped completely, revealing something raw and desperate underneath, not maternal love, but the frustrated rage of someone accustomed to getting what she wanted through charm and manipulation. Edmund stepped forward smoothly, recognizing that his wife's emotional approach was backfiring spectacularly. "Luna, sweetheart, you're too young to understand the complexities of adult decisions," he said in the patronizing tone that had won him elections, but was having the opposite effect on his daughter. Sometimes loving someone means making painful sacrifices for their greater good. Serafina had remained silent through the Blackwoods performance, but now she rose from her chair with the quiet dignity of someone who'd spent 20 years proving love through actions rather than words. "Don't you dare lecture my children about love," she said, her voice carrying the accumulated strength of 2 decades of midnight feedings, scraped knees kissed better, bedtime stories, school plays, and unconditional devotion. "I found them dying because you threw them away like trash, and I've spent every day since then showing them what real love looks like. You want to talk about sacrifice? I sacrificed my retirement savings for their education, my social life for their activities, my comfort for their happiness, not because I had to, but because I chose to every single day." Her words hit the expensive couple like stones, each one carrying the weight of genuine sacrifice they'd never understood or experienced. Victoria's composure cracked further as she realized she was losing a battle she'd expected to win through legal intimidation and emotional manipulation. The confrontation escalated when Edmund made his fatal mistake. He reached for his briefcase and pulled out photographs that made everyone in the room gasp. "This is what we can offer them," he said, spreading glossy images across the kitchen table like playing cards in a high-stakes game. The estate in Ravenhollow, the private jets, the vacation homes in Switzerland and the Caribbean, the connections that will open every door in Washington. But mixed in with the mansion photos were images that revealed his true agenda, pictures of campaign rallies, political fundraisers, and newspaper headlines featuring Senator Blackwood's inspiring family story. Luna snatched one of the photos with shaking hands, her face pale as she read the caption, "Senator Edmund Blackwood with his recently reunited children, survivors of a childhood kidnapping that he heroically resolved through 20 years of tireless searching." The lies were so elaborate, so calculated, that even Serafina gasped at their audacity. These people hadn't come to reclaim their children. They'd come to acquire political props for Edmund's upcoming presidential campaign. "You're using us," Kai said, his voice breaking with the devastating realization that his biological parents saw him and Luna not as beloved children, but as campaign accessories. "This isn't about love or family. It's about your political career." The truth hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was consuming everything they'd thought they knew about this reunion. Victoria tried to backtrack, sensing she was losing control of the narrative, but the damage was done. Luna was staring at the campaign photos with tears streaming down her face, understanding with heartbreaking clarity that she and Kai were being treated like commodities to be acquired rather than children to be loved. "Get out," Serafina said quietly, her voice carrying a strength that made the expensive couple take an involuntary step backward. "Get out of my house and don't come back." But Edmund's smile never wavered as he gathered his photos and legal documents with the confidence of someone who held all the cards. "Mrs. Ashworth, I'm afraid you don't have a choice in this matter. We have legal custody, federal backing, and the resources to ensure our children come home where they belong. The question is whether this happens peacefully or through the courts, but make no mistake, it will happen." That night, the cottage felt like a house under siege, with the Blackwoods ensconced at the Willowmere and just 2 miles down the lake road, waiting for morning to collect their human trophies. Serafina sat at her kitchen table surrounded by 20 years of family photographs, birthday parties, Christmas mornings, fishing trips, school graduations, each image a testament to the love that had grown in the space where tragedy had once lived. Kai and Luna huddled on either side of her, their faces reflecting the devastating realization that their entire world could be legally dismantled by strangers who viewed them as political accessories rather than beloved children. The grandfather clock ticked away their final hours together while outside. Storm clouds gathered over the lake like an omen of the tempest about to tear through their lives. Every photograph on the table told the same story. This was a family built not on blood or law, but on the daily choice to love unconditionally. And now that foundation was cracking under the weight of legal documents and biological claims they couldn't fight without money, lawyers, or official adoption papers. "I want to know where we really came from," Luna said suddenly, breaking the heavy silence that had settled over them like fog. Her dark eyes held a determination that reminded Serafina painfully of the fierce little girl who'd once demanded to know why other children had different families, why she and Kai called her grandmama instead of mom, why they had no baby pictures or birth stories like their classmates. For 20 years, Serafina had protected them from the brutal truth that they'd been abandoned to die by parents who valued political ambition over human life, but now that protection was crumbling. "Tell me everything," Luna continued, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "I need to understand who they really are before I decide whether to go with them." Kai nodded in agreement, his sea-green eyes reflecting the same desperate need for truth that had always driven him to protect wounded animals and stand up for underdogs. They were no longer children who could be shielded from ugly realities. They were 18 years old and about to make the most important decision of their lives. So Serafina told them everything, how she'd been walking toward the lake that terrible night, planning to end her own pain after losing Marcus and Thomas, how she'd found them blue-lipped and barely breathing in the boat, how there had been no note or explanation. Just two dying babies someone had discarded like unwanted cargo. She described their first months together, the way they'd cried in shifts as if they'd agreed to take turns needing her attention, how their presence had gradually filled the terrible silence that had swallowed her house after her family died. Dr. Henderson said another hour in that cold and we'd be planning funerals instead of feedings, she whispered, her voice breaking as she remembered how close they'd come to losing them before they'd ever really had them. Kai's face went white as he absorbed the reality of how casually his biological parents had thrown away his and Luna's lives, while Luna's expression hardened with a rage that made her look suddenly, startlingly adult. The innocent children who'd woken up that morning were gone forever, replaced by young adults who now understood that love was a choice, not an accident of birth. "I want to go with them," Luna said quietly, and the words hit Serafina and Kai like lightning strikes. "Not because I love them or trust them, but because I need to see who they really are, what they really want from us." Her decision was logical but devastating. She'd inherited not just her biological mother's dark eyes, but also her sharp intelligence, and she understood that the only way to defeat the Blackwoods was to understand them completely. Kai exploded with protective fury, his gentle nature giving way to raw panic at the thought of losing his sister to people who'd already proven they viewed children as disposable. "Luna, no. You can't trust them. They'll use you and throw you away again when you're no longer useful." But Luna's mind was made up with the stubborn determination that had once made her insist on learning to fish even though she was afraid of water, on standing up to bullies even though she was small, on protecting every injured creature she'd ever found. "Someone needs to find out what they're really planning," she said with devastating calm. "And I'm the only one who can get close enough to learn the truth." The argument that followed was heartbreaking in its intensity, Kai begging Luna to reconsider, Serafina trying to find alternatives that would keep them together, Luna standing firm in her decision, despite the tears streaming down her face. "I'm not abandoning you," she insisted, gripping Kai's hands with desperate strength. "I'm protecting our family the only way I know how. If I go with them, I can find out what they really want, what their endgame is, and maybe find a way to stop them from destroying us completely." Her logic was sound, but her sacrifice was unbearable. She was choosing to enter the enemy camp to save the people she loved, knowing she might be walking into a trap she couldn't escape. Serafina's heart shattered as she recognized the impossible courage of her youngest child, the girl who'd grown up believing love meant protecting your family even when it cost you everything. Outside, thunder rumbled over the lake like a warning of the storm about to break their world apart, and in 12 hours, Luna would be gone, not because she wanted to leave, but because she was brave enough to sacrifice herself for the family who'd saved her life and taught her what love really meant. Morning came too soon, gray and cold with mist rising off the lake like ghosts of all the happy days that would never come again. Luna had packed a single small bag with trembling hands, taking only the essentials and leaving behind 20 years of memories that suddenly felt more precious than gold. Serafina made her favorite breakfast, blueberry pancakes with real maple syrup, but none of them could eat more than a few bites, their stomachs churning with anxiety and grief that tasted like metal in their mouths. Kai sat rigidly beside his sister, his jaw clenched with the effort of not grabbing her and running away to somewhere the Blackwoods could never find them, while Serafina memorized every detail of Luna's face as if she might never see it again. The kitchen that had been filled with laughter for 2 decades now felt like a tomb, heavy with unspoken fears and the terrible knowledge that after today, nothing would ever be the same. Outside, the black sedan waited like a hearse, its tinted windows reflecting the cottage where a family was about to be torn apart by legal documents and biological claims that meant nothing compared to 20 years of unconditional love. At exactly 10 o'clock, 3 sharp knocks echoed through the house, and Luna rose from the table with the dignity of someone walking to her own execution. She hugged Serafina first, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender and lake air that had meant safety and home for her entire life. "I love you, Grandmama Sarah," she whispered, her voice breaking on words that felt like goodbye. "You saved us, you raised us, you are our real mother no matter what any legal document says." Serafina held her as tightly as she dared, memorizing the weight of her youngest child in her arms, the silk of her dark hair, the way she fit perfectly against her heart like she had as a baby. "You come home to us," she whispered fiercely. "No matter what happens, no matter what they promise or threaten, you remember that this cottage by the lake is your home, and Kai and I will be waiting for you." Then Luna turned to her brother, and their embrace was desperate with 20 years of shared experiences, secret languages, protective instincts, the bond between twins that went deeper than blood or biology. Victoria appeared in the doorway with a triumphant smile that didn't reach her calculating eyes, already dressed in another expensive suit that screamed money and power. "Ready, darling?" she asked in honeyed tones that made Luna's skin crawl, but the 18-year-old forced herself to nod and step forward despite every instinct screaming at her to run back into Serafina's protective embrace. Edmund waited by the sedan with the satisfied expression of someone who'd just acquired a valuable asset, checking his watch with the impatience of a busy man who had important places to be. They didn't understand that they were taking a young woman who'd been loved completely for 18 years, who'd learned from Serafina that family meant fierce protection and unconditional devotion, who possessed her adoptive grandmother's sharp intuition and her brother's protective instincts wrapped in a deceptively small package. The sedan's leather interior smelled of money and emptiness as Luna settled into the back seat between her biological parents, feeling like she was being kidnapped despite the legal documents that made this abduction perfectly legal. Victoria immediately began chattering about shopping trips and private tutors, her voice artificially bright as she tried to fill the uncomfortable silence with promises of material wealth that meant nothing to a girl who'd been raised to value love over luxury. Edmund made phone calls to his campaign manager, discussing photo opportunities and press releases about his miraculous reunion with his long-lost children, his words confirming Luna's worst fears about being used as a political prop. Through the rear window, she watched the cottage grow smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely, taking with it her entire world, Serafina standing in the doorway with tears streaming down her weathered face. Kai's anguished expression burned into her memory forever. She was 18 years old, legally an adult, but she felt like a child being stolen from the only family that had ever mattered, carried away by strangers who shared her DNA but not her heart. As they drove toward Raven Hollow, Luna began her intelligence gathering with the systematic precision Serafina had taught her during their nature walks, when she learned to observe animal behavior by watching quietly and patiently for revealing details. Victoria's constant chatter was nervous energy, the kind of overcompensation people used when they were hiding something important, while Edmund's phone calls revealed a campaign in trouble, poll numbers dropping, and desperate need for a compelling story to rehabilitate his political image. "The family reunion angle is perfect," he told someone on the phone, not bothering to lower his voice around the daughter he was discussing like a campaign asset. Tragic separation, heroic father who never stopped searching, emotional reunification, it'll play beautifully in the Heartland States. Luna absorbed every detail with the sharp attention of someone who'd been trained to love deeply and protect fiercely, understanding that her mission was bigger than just learning the truth. She needed to find a way to protect Kai and Serafina from whatever scheme these people were plotting. The miles rolled by like a countdown to a future she didn't want, carrying her away from everything real toward something that felt like an elaborate, expensive lie. The Blackwood estate in Raven Hollow was everything Edmund had promised: sprawling grounds, marble columns, rooms bigger than Serafina's entire cottage, but Luna felt its oppressive grandeur like a weight on her chest from the moment she crossed its threshold. Her assigned bedroom was 3 times the size of the room she'd shared with Kai, filled with designer furniture and expensive clothes in her exact size, evidence that the Blackwoods had been planning this acquisition for months, while she lived in blissful ignorance by the lake. Victoria gave her a tour with the pride of someone showing off valuable possessions, pointing out the indoor pool, the tennis court, the library filled with leather-bound books that looked like they'd never been opened, the staff quarters where silent servants moved like ghosts through marble hallways. Everything you could ever want, Victoria said with satisfaction, not understanding that Luna had already had everything she'd ever wanted in a cottage by a lake with people who loved her for herself rather than what she represented. The luxury felt suffocating after 18 years of simple abundance: fresh fish from the lake, vegetables from Serafina's garden, wealth measured in laughter and love rather than money and status. Within hours, Luna discovered the true purpose of her rescue when campaign staff began arriving with photographers, stylists, and speechwriters who treated her like a living prop in Edmund's political theater. "We need to craft the narrative carefully," his campaign manager explained while Luna stood frozen in a designer dress she'd never chosen, surrounded by strangers who discussed her traumatic abandonment like a marketing opportunity. "The kidnapping story is powerful, but we need to avoid making the senator look bad for taking 20 years to find them. Maybe we say the kidnappers moved them frequently, made them hard to track." Luna listened with growing horror as they constructed elaborate lies about her childhood, turning Serafina from loving savior into criminal kidnapper, transforming 20 years of genuine family happiness into a tragic tale of children held captive by a deranged woman. The cruelty of their revisionist history made her physically sick. They were planning to destroy the reputation of the woman who'd saved her life, raised her with love, and sacrificed everything to give her a real childhood. The photo shoots began immediately, with Luna posed in various settings designed to tell Edmund's preferred story: grateful daughter reunited with devoted father, tragic victim finally safe with her real family, poster child for never giving up hope. Every smile they demanded felt like a betrayal of Serafina and Kai, but Luna forced herself to comply while gathering intelligence about the campaign's strategy and timeline. She learned that Edmund was trailing badly in presidential primary polls, that his political career was hanging by a thread after a series of scandals involving financial corruption, and that the family reunion story was his last hope for rehabilitation. "Voters love a redemption narrative," his campaign manager explained during a strategy meeting Luna wasn't supposed to overhear. Heroic father who never gave up searching for his stolen children, emotional reunification, family values triumph over tragedy. It's perfect for the evangelical vote we've been losing. Victoria nodded enthusiastically, her maternal act disappearing entirely when she thought no one was watching, replaced by the calculating ambition of someone who'd spent 20 years building political power and refused to let biological inconveniences derail her plans. The breaking point came when Luna discovered the campaign's secret weapon. They were planning to have her testify before Congress about her kidnapping ordeal, with carefully scripted testimony that would paint Serafina as a mentally unstable woman who'd stolen babies during a psychotic break after losing her own family. The lies were so elaborate, so vicious, so perfectly designed to destroy an innocent woman's reputation while advancing Edmund's political career, that Luna felt something cold and hard crystallize in her chest where her heart used to be. She realized with devastating clarity that she wasn't just being used as a prop, she was being transformed into a weapon aimed at the woman who'd saved her life and loved her unconditionally for 18 years. They wanted her to stand before the nation and lie about the most beautiful relationship she'd ever known, to betray the woman who'd taught her what love really meant, to participate in destroying Serafina's life for the sake of Edmund's presidential ambitions. The script they'd prepared for her testimony was filled with fabricated details about abuse, neglect, and psychological manipulation, none of it true. All of it designed to justify their 20-year absence while positioning them as heroic parents who'd finally rescued their children from a monster. That night, alone in her luxurious prison, Luna made her decision with the same quiet determination that had once made her insist on learning to fish despite her fear of water. She would play their game just long enough to gather the evidence she needed to expose their lies. Then she would find a way back to the people who loved her for herself rather than what she could do for their ambitions. Outside her bedroom window, she could see the lights of the city where powerful people made decisions that destroyed ordinary families for political gain, where love was just another commodity to be bought and sold for the right price. But somewhere beyond those lights was a cottage by a lake where an old woman and a young man were waiting for her to come home, where her real family was counting on her to find the truth and find a way back to them. She was 18 years old, trapped in a golden cage by people who shared her DNA but not her heart, and she had perhaps days before they forced her to testify against the woman who'd taught her that family was a choice, not an accident of birth. The war for her soul had begun, and Luna was ready to fight for the family that had chosen her when her biological parents had thrown her away like trash. 3 weeks into her captivity at the Blackwood estate, Luna discovered the smoking gun that would destroy Edmund's political career and expose the truth about her abandonment. A locked filing cabinet in his study that she accessed during one of the campaign strategy meetings when everyone was distracted by poll numbers and speech rehearsals. Inside, she found documents that made her blood run cold, psychiatric evaluations of Victoria from 20 years ago, detailing severe postpartum psychosis and violent thoughts toward her newborn twins, followed by Edmund's cold calculation that institutionalizing his wife would destroy his budding political career. The abandonment hadn't been about political threats from enemies, it had been about an ambitious young senator who'd chosen his career over getting his sick wife the help she needed and his babies the safety they deserved. Medical records showed that Victoria had been hearing voices telling her to harm the children, that she'd tried to suffocate them twice before Edmund had made his cruel decision to abandon them during the blizzard, hoping they'd die quietly without any trail leading back to his family's mental illness. More horrifying still were Edmund's private notes, written in his own hand 20 years ago, coldly calculating the political benefits of his children's disappearance. Dead babies would generate sympathy, but too many questions, he'd written with sociopathic precision. Missing children allow for heroic father narrative when convenient for campaign purposes. V's illness cannot become public knowledge, career suicide in conservative districts. Abandon during storm, let nature decide, claim ignorance if questioned. Luna read his words with shaking hands, understanding that she and Kai had been left to die not in a moment of panic, but as the result of careful political calculation by a man who viewed his own children as potential liabilities to be disposed of when convenient. The documents also revealed that the Blackwoods had known exactly where the twins were for the past 5 years, ever since a private investigator had tracked them to Serafina's cottage. But Edmund had waited to reclaim them until his presidential campaign needed a compelling story to overcome his corruption scandals. The escape plan crystallized in Luna's mind with the same systematic precision Serafina had taught her during their nature walks: observe, plan, act decisively when the moment was right. She photographed every document with the phone they'd given her to stay connected with her new family, then began watching the household routines with the patience of someone who'd learned to fish by waiting hours for the perfect catch. The staff changed shifts at midnight, the security guards made rounds every 2 hours, and there was a 15-minute window when the kitchen entrance was unmonitored while they checked the grounds. She packed nothing, no designer clothes or expensive gifts, just the evidence hidden in her phone and a desperate need to warn Serafina and Kai about the congressional testimony that was scheduled for the following week. The night she chose was stormy, rain lashing against the mansion's windows like nature itself was angry about the lies and manipulation happening under its marble roof. At exactly 12:15, she slipped through the kitchen door into the darkness, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and determination as she began the most dangerous journey of her life. The 20-mile trek through storm and darkness to reach the train station tested every survival skill Serafina had taught her during their camping trips and nature explorations. Luna moved through forests and fields like a ghost, avoiding main roads where Edmund's security team would look for her, following old hiking trails and creek beds that led gradually toward the railway line that would carry her home. The rain soaked through her clothes and the wind cut through her like knives, but she pressed forward with the relentless determination of someone who'd been raised to protect family at any cost. Every step carried her farther from the golden prison where she'd been displayed like a trophy, closer to the cottage where love was measured in presence rather than presence, where family meant choosing each other every day rather than sharing DNA. The storm that had nearly killed her as a baby now became her ally, hiding her escape and washing away her trail while she fought through the darkness toward the people who'd taught her that courage meant doing what was right even when it was terrifying. By dawn, she was on a southbound train with her evidence safely uploaded to a cloud server and copies sent to 3 different news organizations. Her phone calls to Serafina and Kai confirming that they were safe, but terrified about the congressional hearing scheduled for that afternoon. Luna's testimony was supposed to be the centerpiece of Edmund's campaign rehabilitation, with live television coverage and a carefully orchestrated narrative about heroic parents rescuing their children from a deranged kidnapper. Instead, he would face empty chairs and a media firestorm when reporters received copies of his private documents proving that he'd abandoned his own children to die for political convenience, then lied about it for 20 years while building his career on a foundation of calculated cruelty. The train carried her through landscapes that gradually became familiar, rolling hills, small towns, finally the Lake District where she'd spent 18 years learning what love really looked like. In 6 hours, she would be home with the family that had chosen her when her biological parents had thrown her away, armed with evidence that would destroy their lies and protect the woman who'd saved her life from the congressional testimony designed to paint her as a monster. The cottage by the lake had never looked more beautiful than it did when Luna stumbled up the gravel path at sunset, exhausted from her journey, but carrying the evidence that would save her family from destruction. Serafina and Kai were waiting on the porch as if they'd been there for 3 weeks, their faces transforming from worry to joy to fierce protective love as they gathered Luna into their arms like she was returning from war. And in a way, she'd survived the golden prison of her biological parents' ambition, gathered the intelligence needed to protect her real family, and chosen love over luxury in a way that proved everything Serafina had taught her about what family really meant. "I have proof," she whispered against Serafina's shoulder, breathing in the scent of lavender and lake air that meant home and safety and unconditional love. "I have proof of everything, why they abandoned us, why they came back, what they were planning to do to us and to you." The documents on her phone would destroy Edmund's political career, expose Victoria's untreated mental illness, and reveal the calculated cruelty behind their 20-year absence, but more importantly, they would protect Serafina from the lies designed to paint her as a kidnapper rather than the savior she truly was. The media explosion that followed Luna's revelations was everything Edmund had feared and more: front-page headlines about the senator who'd abandoned his babies to die for political convenience, congressional hearings canceled in disgrace, poll numbers plummeting toward zero as voters recoiled from the depths of his calculated cruelty. Victoria suffered a complete nervous breakdown when the psychiatric records became public, finally receiving the mental health treatment she'd needed 20 years earlier, while Edmund's presidential campaign collapsed so completely that he resigned from the Senate rather than face impeachment proceedings. But in the cottage by the lake, the family that had been forged by choice rather than birth barely watched the news coverage. They were too busy repairing the bonds that political ambition had tried to shatter. Luna told them everything about her weeks in captivity, from the suffocating luxury that had felt like a tomb to the campaign staff who'd treated her like a prop to the horrifying discovery of how coldly Edmund had calculated their abandonment. Kai held his sister while she cried for the childhood innocence that had been destroyed by learning the truth about their biological parents, while Serafina made her favorite blueberry pancakes and reminded her that some people's cruelty only made other people's kindness shine brighter. The legal aftermath was swift and decisive: child abandonment charges against Edmund, psychiatric commitment proceedings for Victoria, and most importantly, a federal judge who declared that 20 years of love and sacrifice trumped biological claims based on documents signed by criminals. Serafina became Luna and Kai's legal guardian retroactively, their family finally recognized by law as well as love, their bond officially unbreakable by political ambition or biological claims. The twins changed their last name from Blackwood to Ashworth, honoring the woman who'd chosen them when their birth parents had thrown them away, cementing their identity as children of love rather than accidents of DNA. News organizations offered huge sums for exclusive interviews about their story, but the family turned them all down. Their private happiness was worth more than public attention, their quiet love more valuable than fame or fortune. The cottage by the lake became a sanctuary where healing happened slowly, day by day. As Luna and Kai processed the trauma of learning how close they'd come to being murdered for political convenience, while celebrating the miracle of being saved by someone who'd loved them completely from the first moment she'd held them. As autumn painted the lake in shades of gold and crimson, Serafina began to slow down in ways that worried her children, but didn't surprise her. 73 years of life, including the stress of nearly losing her family to political predators, had taken their toll on her aging body. She spent her days teaching Luna and Kai everything she could about maintaining their home, managing their small inheritance, and most importantly, carrying forward the lesson that family was built through daily choices rather than biological accidents. "I saved you," she told them one evening as they watched the sunset paint the lake in shades of rose and purple, "but you saved me too. After I lost Marcus and Thomas, I thought my life was over, but you two gave me 20 more years of purpose and joy than I ever thought possible." Her words carried the weight of a woman who'd learned that love was the only thing that mattered in the end, that choosing to protect and nurture was the highest calling any human could answer. On a peaceful morning in early December, exactly 20 years after she'd found 2 dying babies in her boat, Serafina passed away in her sleep with a smile on her face and a letter on her bedside table that made Luna and Kai cry and laugh at the same time. "My darling children," it read in her familiar handwriting, "you were never abandoned. You were planted in my boat like seeds in fertile soil, waiting to grow into the most beautiful family I could have imagined." Love is not about blood or law or what society expects. It's about choosing each other every day, protecting each other always, and remembering that the families we build are often stronger than the ones we're born into. Transform this cottage into something that helps other abandoned children find love like you found with me. That is my legacy, and it is my gift to the world. They buried her next to Marcus and Thomas in the village cemetery, then returned to the cottage that had sheltered 3 generations of chosen love. Within a year, they'd transformed it into the Serafina Ashworth Children's Home, a place where abandoned children could find safety, love, and families who chose them not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The dock where she'd once found 2 dying babies became a symbol of hope for children across the country, proof that love could bloom in the most unlikely places, and that the best families were often forged by choice rather than chance. Luna and Kai grew old in the cottage by the lake, surrounded by generations of children who learned that family meant protection, devotion, and the daily decision to love unconditionally, a lesson that rippled outward like stones thrown into still water, changing the world one rescued child at a time.